You know how absolutely hypocritical the left are. All their own rules about lived experience, about respecting minority voices, about respecting women, people of colour, refugees, whatever other boxes I tick in their oppression Olympics. None of that matters if you don't identify as a victim.
To get Brexit.
Make America great again.
No, no, no.
This is Stephen Edginton for The Sun, and today I'm interviewing Rita Panahi. Rita Panahi is an Australian Conservative. She's a Sky News Australia host and a columnist. Her parents fled from Iran during the 1979 revolution, and we're going to be talking all about the current revolution going on in the West and with our culture. So I hope you enjoy. Thank you so much for joining us, Rita.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
We've seen statues come down. We've seen the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement. Is this the West's cultural revolution?
Well, I hope not, because having grown up in a totalitarian regime, it's not something I want to tackle again as an adult. But we are seeing just mass mob violence, intolerance, and disregard for rule of law and disregard for the wishes of the mainstream. We are democratic nations where this is happening. This is happening throughout the West, where we have free, open elections on a regular basis and people vote a certain way. And all of that seems to have been superseded by this mob insanity.
Where did this come from? I mean, can you talk through a bit of where you think the history of this movement lies?
Well, I think there's a number of factors, but the decades of indoctrination in schools, straight from primary school and particularly at universities, has an impact. And we like to think that once people enter the real world, that indoctrination is left behind and they have a better appreciation of how things really are. But of course it has an impact. And those people are now in positions of influence. The products of that education system are company CEOs, they're in the public sector, they're politicians. And the left has been very clever at having that long march through the institutions. They are unashamed about fighting the culture wars, whilst I think many conservatives think it's beneath them. They want to focus on worthy things like the economy and surpluses, but culture wars are actually fairly critical and they matter to everyday people and they impact everyday people's lives. It's not just some nonsense that's confined to university campuses or Twitter.
And as you say, with many Conservatives not even bothering to talk about these issues, and the left really dominating in the media and other aspects of our everyday life, where is this heading to? Where do you think this is going to end?
There's a couple of things I think can happen. That silent majority might spark up, and then you might have all sorts of consequences for that. The other issue you might have is, what's the term the left like to use? You could have people radicalised. So if we've got this obsession about identity politics and characterising every white person as inherently racist and privileged and an oppressor, then that is the very sort of rhetoric that feeds into the narrative that genuine white supremacists like to push, that they're the ones who are being hard done by, that, you know, the world's against them. So I would hate to see that. I would hate to see the rise of a genuine extreme right, not what the media call extreme right, which is pretty much anything that's, you know, even this much over from the left. So because I think that would be, again, dangerous, just like the extreme left is dangerous. But I do hope that as people see this incursion into their world, whether we're talking about removing TV programs from streaming services, whether we're renaming products, whether we're tearing down statues and tolerating rioting and looting and all sorts of other lawlessness. Hopefully that does wake up that mainstream who are fairly apathetic, who are not that involved and engaged in these political games, and they have a say. I hope so. But I really have been surprised by how weak the so-called conservative politicians have been, whether we're talking about the UK, the US, and even here in Australia. We haven't had the issues you've seen in the UK. We haven't had the violence and the statues attacked in the same manner. We have had a couple vandalised, but I just can't believe that Boris Johnson, having on the back of this massive election victory, this enormous mandate, has just been so weak in the face of this. I can't remember the commentator who said this. Yeah, the Tories are in government, but they're certainly not in power.
Do you think it's cowardice? Is that the reason why Boris and many others, I mean, in America, you could point to politicians like Mitt Romney, the former Republican candidate for president, and he's going on these Black Lives Matter protests, many conservatives agreeing with him. So is it cowardice, or do you think they genuinely believe in this cause?
I think it's mainly absolute cowardice. One, in their circles, the people they prefer to be surrounded by, whether we're talking about celebrities or academics or high profile commentators, that's the accepted rhetoric. So I think that's got a small part to do with it. But I think at the heart of it, it's cowardice. And much of it is based on the fact that if you stand up to this nonsense, if you just state facts that are not in dispute, that you will be absolutely monstered by the bulk of the media. And I think that is what's at the heart of the reaction of so many politicians. And the media has been so captured by this far left ideology, particularly when it comes to identity politics and these race obsessed politics, seeing everything through this filter of race and this critical race theory. That's really taken a hold in much of the media. And I think that has a lot to do with politicians as well as other prominent people getting on board with this activism, and because they don't want to be the one who is getting the bad press, the one who's having his decency questioned and being labelled a racist. I mean, that's what we've come to. If you say something like all lives matter, which I would have thought would be a fairly uncontroversial sort of comment, you can lose your job. You can be cancelled. You can be branded a racist. That's where we are at the moment. And I think we're there because we've had generations of conservatives who have been too cowardly or just too short-sighted to deal with these issues.
Let's talk about the All Lives Matter phrase for a second. Let's focus in on that. The argument that those who support Black Lives Matter say, yeah, of course, all lives matter. But this phrase is specifically used to undermine the movement of Black Lives Matter, and that is completely unacceptable. That is heresy. So what do you say to that sort of argument? Well,
that's insane to begin with. And there should be nothing wrong with questioning the movement Black Lives Matter. Of course, every person in the world with any decency thinks Black Lives Matter, as you think any life matters. But the Black Lives Matter movement is something very different. And these groups are very clever at giving themselves names that you could never possibly argue with, whether it's anti-fascist or Black Lives Matter or whatever the group is. But what is the actual movement? What does the movement stand for? What is their political agenda? And you don't have to look too deeply with Black Lives Matter to see that at its heart, it is got a number of defined political objectives. It is an anti-police group. It is one that is definitely anti-capitalist. That's at the heart of so much of their activism. And they are neo-Marxist. They're unashamed about it. Their founders speak about that. They identify as Marxists. They say that they're well-versed in that ideology and that is their motivation. So I don't know why we can't talk about this and without people losing their minds. If you're going to pledge allegiance for Black Lives Matter, if you're going to take a knee in their name or protest in their name, then you should know what they stand for. And If you're okay with that, then good for you. But if you actually aren't for defunding the police, if you're actually not anti-capitalist, if you're not about dismantling the nuclear family, then I'd question why you are pledging allegiance to a group who push those agendas.
I want to go a bit deeper into Black Lives Matter later on in the interview. But for now, let's focus in on the statues issue. As you say, in Australia, there hasn't been, I don't think there's been many statues being removed, but in Britain and America, we've had people actually illegally go down and tear down statues all across both countries. And they say that these historical figures are racist. They say that these historical figures are slave owners, for example, or held with views now that we would see as being horrific. But I want to put you to the main argument that they have for tearing down these statues is that, let's say that I'm a person of colour or I'm a black person, and I feel so utterly offended walking by a statue of, let's say, for example, a slave owner from a few hundred years ago because my ancestors were enslaved. Let's say you're a Jewish person and you walk past a statue of Adolf Hitler. You'd probably be a little bit offended. So maybe that's the kind of argument that they put towards, why we should be tearing down these statues.
Well, I would put it like the Hitler comparison is fairly asinine, to be honest. And I'd put it to you that those statues, none that I know of, weren't put up because someone was a slave trader. Even the ones who were slave traders, the statues was typically for charitable works they did, or the nation building work they did, or the contribution they made to that area. Now, I have no problem with acknowledging that, yes, their record isn't squeaky clean. That money that they used to build that area or to donate to charities was blood money. That's fine, but to actually try to erase that history and to have, again, the mob do it, not go through in a democratic society, having a vote, getting people elected, and then deciding, this is in line with our values, we're going to do that, just to tear something down and chuck it in the harbour. That's not how civilised society works. And this entire phenomenon of appropriating the suffering of your ancestors, I find so toxic and counterproductive. Now, all of us, if we go back far enough, will have ancestors who were treated terribly. Does that mean you've got to live your life as a victim? Does that mean that you've got to see yourself as oppressed because your ancestors suffered terrible misdeeds? I just find that really quite gross, that appropriating of victimhood. What your life is now is what should concern you, not I'm not saying don't have an interest in your ancestry and your history, but that shouldn't dictate how you feel about society now and what you see. And if we're going to judge historical figures by today's standards, then who's possibly going to pass muster? Who's going to be, by 2020 standards, sufficiently progressive, who's going to have the right attitudes towards sexuality, towards gender, towards all the issues that we talk about by today's standards? Isn't there some sort of a petition to get Gandhi's statue removed in the UK? I mean, you lot have completely lost your minds, if you don't mind me saying. We're looking on from Australia, and I tell you, it is a topic for regular discussion on Sky News Australia and elsewhere about what's happening in the UK. What's happened to the sensible majority? What's happened to the people who voted only a few months back?
It's not just Gandhi. We've got Abraham Lincoln, obviously famous racist and has done terrible things for black people, and Winston Churchill, complete fascist, some people would say, and worse than Hitler. Of course, I'm joking. Should we be ashamed of our history?
No, I mean, as someone who's a migrant to Australia, a migrant to the West, there's a reason why people absolutely risk their lives, would give up anything to live in the West. They're not going there because it is something to be ashamed of, because you've built something that is just racist and oppressive and miserable. It's because that's where there actually is equality, opportunity, that you're not condemned by your birth to live a certain way. And as someone I was born in the States, but I grew up in Iran, and Iran went from being very much a Western type country, or the most Western probably in the Middle East, to becoming an Islamist dictatorship. And you saw there very quickly people's personal freedoms being eradicated, and to this day, 40 years later, women are second-class citizens. People are locked up for protesting hijab laws. People are killed for political dissent. Homosexuality is still a crime punishable by death. So you can see societies go backwards. And that's why I'm particularly concerned, because I've seen what that is, and I guess you don't have to live through it. You can just open up a history book or two and have a read. And I would hate to see that sort of mindset bleed into the West. The West is founded on enlightenment. It's about, it's why slavery was seen as such an evil sin. That's why it was eradicated. It's not embraced. There are parts of the world right now where slavery is still in practice. And it just blows my mind that people who are so obsessed about historic slavery seem to have no concern about what's happening in Libya, for example, where Africans are being bought and sold, mistreated horribly. We know it's happening, it's being documented, and yet that doesn't cause any sort of outrage compared with slavery that happened generations ago. And that's what makes me question the activists about really what are your priorities? Are you using this as just a way to push agendas that have got nothing to do with racism or police brutality? Or do you actually care about the issue? Because if you care about the issue, then you should care about what's happening in Libya. What's
fascinating is that a lot of these left-wing activist types, they talk about the evils of capitalism and we must tear down the system that we live in. But maybe they forget that, you don't have to go that far back in history where pretty much all of our ancestors, 99% of people, lived in absolute poverty. It wasn't a good situation for almost anyone. It was a very, very small amount of people who held wealth and power. It didn't matter who you were. And then obviously we had the capitalist revolution, the systems that came in place. And today, fortunately, we're able to live in these sort of free societies, and you're able to go from Iran to Australia. And I want to talk about that experience in Iran. Does obviously you're a conservative and you're media commentator. Do the left give you any kind of credit because their identity politics system would say, well, look, you're a person of colour, you're a political refugee, you're on our side?
Oh, you know the answer to that. You know how absolutely hypocritical the left are. All their own rules about lived experience, about respecting minority voices, about respecting women, people of colour, refugees, whatever other boxes I tick in their oppression Olympics. None of that matters if you don't identify as a victim and if you're not an obedient migrant pet who regurgitates the As soon as you start thinking for yourself and countering some of the crap that they put out there, in fact, there can be far more vicious towards people of colour or other minorities who are conservative than to white conservatives, because it's almost expected of us to be parroting their crap. And it's like, how dare you speak out and say something that you think. So no, and then 99.9% of any sort of racism or sexism I've copped has been from the so-called tolerant left. So, I mean, that hypocrisy is almost expected now. It's unremarkable. So I'm sorry, I forgot the first part of your question because I've just been thinking of some examples of some of the abuse I've copped. Every now and then I will highlight it. Most of it I just, block often. But every now and then I'll highlight it, say, on Twitter, and really more for the amusement of my followers than making any sort of point. But it is very common to have that reaction. But sorry, what was the first part of that question?
It was sort of about the oppression of most people throughout history.
Oh, of course, capitalism. Sorry, yeah, you're 100% right. And again, statistical proof is there for anyone who's interested to look at it. To look at things like living standards, infant mortality rates, poverty rates. All of those things are all going in the right direction, and that's due mainly to capitalism. Now, that doesn't fit the narrative that many like to push, so you don't hear about it. I mean, you would think that sort of good news would be worthy of being reported on. The fact that we actually are having far less people living in abject poverty, that there is a path for people to improve their lives. And you can, particularly in places like Australia, America, go from the lowest socioeconomic category to the highest. There is that opportunity to succeed. And if you look at America, for example, the ethnicity with the highest median salary is Indian, followed by a bunch of Asian countries and other non-white categories. So again, it just shows you that if you work hard, if you are dedicated, there is an opportunity to succeed. And that's why so many migrants do want to go to America, do want to go to Australia, the UK and other Western countries, because they want a better life for their families. And the fact that you can achieve a better life in the West, you would think would be a source of pride for these insane lunatics in the streets. But no, they see the West as the world's problem, as opposed to something to aspire to lift others out of that destitute poverty that afflicts them. And there's some certain countries, if you're born poor, you will be poor for the rest of your life. There is no opportunity. Doesn't matter how talented you are, doesn't matter how clever you are, no matter how great your work ethic is, that's your destiny. And that is, I think, an evil that we should be combating, not what we've got in the West.
Now, obviously, you work for Sky News Australia, and I have to say, over in the UK, we've basically got absolutely our broadcast media is, I mean, it's so incredibly liberal, left wing. I think pretty much everyone can agree on that. And watching, you on Sky.
So is Australia, though. So is Australia. I've got to say, people see Sky News Australia and they see me, or they see a couple of other newspaper columnists like Andrew Bolt and think, oh, Australia, that's where you get fair and balanced media. No, Australian media, like most of the Western media, leans very much left. The difference is there is a Sky News, and in the evenings it has programming that have got a conservative bent. So there is actually some counter to that overwhelming media narrative. But in the overall scheme of things, it's a small part. It's not, the 50% of the media by any stretch of the imagination. And even in the News Corp papers, the Murdoch papers, there's as many left-leaning columnists as they are right-leaning columnists, if you actually take the time to go through to the opinion pages. And when it comes to the journalists, not the columnists, the ones that are supposed to be completely fair and impartial across the board, not just talking News Corp, having met many of them and know their politics, they do, like the rest of the media, tend to lean left, and it's reflected in their work. But your Sky News is a piece of work, isn't it? I see clips every now and then, and my goodness, yeah, there's things there that yeah, you know what it is.
If people want to see, the views of those presenters, then just follow them on Twitter. I mean, Adam Bolton is the Sky News UK's editor-at-large. Anyone follow him on Twitter and you'll see what Rita and I are talking about. Anyway, I do want to talk about the media in a minute, but my original question was going to be about you, because, I mean, I've seen you on Sky News Australia, and I think I and, hundreds of thousands of people, many people in the UK are sort of mind blown. We love watching you with your fantastic monologues, and, we sort of get another side of the political aisle on broadcast media, which is fantastic. And you've got this, when I was researching you for this interview, you've got this really interesting history coming from Iran over to Australia. And I think I read somewhere that you chanted anti-American slogans in your school, for example. So how did you go
No,
from...
no, I never did it. I mouthed it. I refused to chant it.
Good for you.
But yeah, that was part of the schooling in Iran. The indoctrination starts early, and you chant "Death to America" at school assembly before the school day starts. It's a routine part. And me being American born and having that connection to the States, as you can imagine, I wasn't keen on that sort of indoctrination. So even from my earliest memories of school, I remember hating that. I remember hating having the hijab, because before I started school, I didn't have to wear it. I was free. And then to go to school, you have to be veiled. You can't go to school with your hair showing if you're a girl. So, again, I absolutely loathed that. I didn't understand all the meaning behind the veil and what it represented. I just hated it as a child, having it imposed on me and being forced to wear it, even in the stifling heat. So yeah, it's a fairly, I guess, colourful upbringing. And then coming to Australia, which is it's as different as you can get to Tehran. The issue I had, though I was born in the States, we left when I was, 1 or something, 1.5. So I didn't have any English. I had literally 2 words. So that was a bit of a shock as well to start.
What were the words?
What were the words?
Tea and hello. They were the 2 words I knew.
Useful.
Useful.
Almost, yeah, that's pretty much all you need. So I started grade 3. I think grade 3 was almost over is when I started school, and could not understand, obviously, a single word. But luckily, English is a pretty simple language for kids to learn. So it only took a short period of time before I was okay language-wise. And, yeah, it was exhilarating, that feeling of freedom. You feel it immediately, especially I think if you are female and you go from somewhere like Iran to Australia.
Well, it's interesting, and I think you've partly answered my question, but I find it interesting how you can go from living in Iran to coming to Australia and to becoming such a now prolific commentator. How did that journey happen? I mean, were you always conservative? Did you ever have left-wing views? Were you a bit of a rebel? I know you've mentioned there you're a bit of a rebel in Iran. Did you have this kind of rebellious streak in you?
Well, yeah, I think I made the progress that a lot of people make, young people make, where you're lean left as a youngster, and then as you sort of go through life, you eventually become more conservative as you see how the world actually works, as opposed to the ideology or the idealism that you may have had that was fanciful when tested against the real world. So what's that great Churchill line? If you're not left when you're young, you have no heart, and if you're not right when you're an adult, you have no brain. I've mangled it, but that was the gist of it. And I think that was for me. So I leaned left as a teenager, and I think sort of by the age of 2021, I started thinking, oh, wait a second, that's actually, the things that I value, equality, opportunity, fairness, they're actually not left-wing ideals anymore. That's not what I'm seeing in practice. And that's, I think, where I made the shift. But as far as becoming part of the media, that was almost all by accident, really. It was not something that I planned, but here we are. But now I kind of want to retire. I'm too busy. I want to just move overseas and do nothing. That's my plan.
No, you mustn't. You must continue.
Well, I tell you, this bloody coronavirus stuff has really... I don't know if it's the fact that I can't travel, because I do love to travel, and I travel a fair bit. And so I had to cancel a trip March, April to South Africa and Mozambique. And I can't book another overseas trip because we actually don't know when the borders are ever going to open again for Australia. Australia's just blocked people coming and going. And And yeah, that is just giving me itchy feet. I'm just like, I just want to travel for 2 years. I don't want to do anything but travel. So yeah, I'm losing my mind. I think I'm having some sort of a midlife crisis where I just want to pack it in and go
on a gap
on
year.
a massive road trip.
Go on a gap year.
But
That's
yeah,
what you need to do.
maybe
That's what you need to do.
I need gap years. I need to do, and I want to do a big road trip across the States. There's so much of the States I haven't seen. And I've probably seen more of Europe than I have America. So yeah, that's my mind right now. Not that you asked, but here we are.
Well, I share your aspirations. Let's get back to Australia. When you got to Australia, did you feel welcomed? Because, and just to give you a bit of context behind that question, many young people in Australia, in Britain, in America, believe that they live in deeply racist societies. They believe that it's systemically racist and that when migrants come over here, especially people of colour, they are discriminated against and, you know, it's not a great place to be.
Well, again, that's an opinion that I think is drilled into them by academia and as so much of the media, and it is completely and utterly ill-founded. There is genuine racism in the world. Very little of it exists in the West. That's as close as we've come to eradicating racism, systematic or otherwise. And people are very welcoming, but if you're desperate to be a victim, if you're going to look at every interaction in a filter of victimhood, then you're kind of going to be miserable. You know, people always ask me, even though I've obviously got an Australian accent and I've lived here for more than 30 years, they always ask me, you know, what's your background? Now, I could look at that and be offended, or I could look at that and say, they're interested in my background. Obviously, I'm not Anglo-Saxon. I probably have come from somewhere. So I'll tell them my background. That's not something that would be a source of concern for me. But for many people, it is. Something as simple as that. It's like, well, why am I asked where I come from? I've lived here all my life, or I was born here. Well, it's a question. You don't have to look at it that way. And that's just one example, but there's just so many people who are desperate to be victims, because victimhood has become virtue now. It's almost like a badge of honour where it shows that you're somehow worthy. I don't get that. I just could not understand why you want to identify as a victim if you're not a victim. It's really quite destructive and counterproductive. But no, Australia to me has been wonderfully welcoming, and it is to migrants. You know, you can come here and very quickly build a wonderful life for yourself and your family. You know, you can, even if you've got a little bit of a work ethic, if you've got any smarts, if you've got, you know, some get up and go, you can, in a very reasonably short period of time, have a lifestyle that's the envy of much of the world. I mean, most of the world doesn't live like we live. What we consider poverty in Australia is very different to what they consider poverty in many other parts of the world. So I consider myself enormously lucky to be an Australian.
Do you think coming from Iran and sort of having that brief glimpse of living in an authoritarian state has made you sort of understand just how lucky we are to live in the societies that we do? And maybe how has that added to your outlook in life, just generally?
Well, yeah, I've got that gratitude, and I think gratitude's an important thing to have. I think it's just in life, it's a good quality to have. It makes you a happier person. You can choose to have some gratitude. You can choose to be miserable. They're choices you have. And I think it just gives you a different perspective where you don't obsess about the nonsense. You know, I see pieces written about sexist air conditioning and wanting to change the name of, you know, ice creams, and obsessing about crap that is just so meaningless in the overall scheme of things. And you go, what the hell's wrong with these people? Do they not know that there's actual real suffering in the world, that there's actual oppression, genuine oppression in 2020, that if you want to rail against something, rail against that. Rail against the fact that in the Middle East, most of the Middle East, women are second-class citizens. They don't have the rights that men do. There's plenty in the world to be genuinely angry about, but the angriest people in our society are fixated on the absolute trivial and imaginary grievances that they have.
It is extraordinary that people can get so caught up in issues such as Little Britain. You know, how dare that programme air on the BBC or whatever it is. And, you know, you've mentioned there that there are so many other countries around the world, China, Iran, the Middle East, where there is genuine, you know, real oppression ingrained in law. Why do you think they ignore those countries, particularly the Middle East? Why do you think the left ignores those issues?
Well, one, cowardice. Two, that would actually take a real effort. And three, you can't push through your agendas piggybacking off things like racism or police brutality if you actually are tackling it where it's happening. You know, if they were concerned about those issues genuinely, they would be doing that right now. They would be concerned about more than 1 million Uyghurs in concentration camps in China, or worried about women being locked up for fighting against compulsory hijabs in Iran, or women fighting against all the guardianship laws and other forms of subjugation in Saudi Arabia. That would be an issue for them. And just this week I saw PlayStation change their logo for Europe, for Australia, UK, to the rainbow motif for Pride Month. But PlayStation Arabia, that official account, that one didn't change. Now, that is one place where some corporate virtue signalling would actually be appreciated. It would actually be beneficial because, as you know, in a number of countries in the Middle East and around that Arabia Peninsula, homosexuality is not only illegal, but it can be punishable by death. Now, that's where showing support for the LGBT community would mean something as a big brand. But that's when they go missing. But in the West, they're loud and proud and screaming about their woke credentials there. So it is so empty and vacuous, much of this moral posturing, and you don't have to scratch the surface too much to see at the heart of it is a very different agenda to the one that they want you to think they're pushing.
I want to get back to the Black Lives Matter movement, and the reason for that is just I think it's it's become, you know, one of the biggest political causes I've ever seen in my lifetime. It's become completely mainstream. The media support it. Everyone on my Instagram feed are sharing their black squares in support.
Oh God, that was such a good marker to go unfollow people. It's like, I love that there was a little meme done of Ralph from The Simpsons where he's holding up the black Instagram post and saying, I'm helping. And that's what it is. It's just so dumb. And yeah, it's almost become taboo if you don't support Black Lives Matter movement, regardless of the fact that they are a Marxist group. Again, they're unashamed about that.
Well, this is the thing I want to ask you about this, is because most people that I know, sort of young people, friends of mine, most of them were sharing the black squares and just didn't think of anything of it. This is an anti-racism campaign. We're all anti-racist here. We all believe that Black Lives Matter, and that's fine. And you've talked previously and just then about how the Black Lives Matter movement is in fact a Marxist movement that wants to overturn capitalism and has all of these very high-minded, left-wing, radical goals. So can you just explain to people who are pretty apolitical, don't do much critical thinking or reading, or actually perhaps, and you can't really blame them for this, they haven't really seen many other perspectives on this movement because the media is so one-sided, that why would they ever experience, that being outside of this big echo chamber? So can you just give people a kind of perspective on why you think that the Black Lives Matter movement have these different kind of left-wing goals and what the true meaning is behind that movement? Well,
like I said, they're unashamed about their agenda and their background. The co-founders self-identify as Marxist organisers. One of them went to Venezuela and cozied up to the Maduro regime, posed for photos with Maduro, shared a stage with him, tweeted about how wonderful it was to be in a place where there was intelligent political discourse. This is a country with the world's worst rate of law enforcement murdering unarmed citizens. They kill political dissidents there. The UN has issued reports about this. So if you actually care about police brutality and Black lives, why would you be cozying up to a regime where police brutality is the norm, where thousands in 2018 alone, they killed over 5,000 people. I mean, their rate per capita in Venezuela is higher than Syria and Afghanistan. So I think people, if they just did a little bit of digging and looked into even just visiting Black Lives Matter's own website, getting an insight there of what they talk about, and then going a bit further and a bit deeper than that. But you're right, they shouldn't have to. If a group is this prominent, if they're dominating the political discourse, if you've got corporations, politicians, prominent people backing them, you would think the media would give you a full picture of what this group is about. And the media hasn't. Can you imagine if there was a conservative group with that kind of influence? You think their founders, their three founders' backgrounds and statements wouldn't be out there and wouldn't be analysed and talked about? Of course, but we just get this fluffy picture that this is just purely a group that's concerned with racism and equality, and surely all of us want to eradicate racism and have greater equality. You know, that's the disingenuous way that this is talked about in the bulk of the media. So it is really quite disappointing that people are surprised to find out that at the heart of it, Black Lives Matter movement is anti-capitalist. That is at the heart of their movement. How could that not be discussed more widely? The ramifications of that, if they actually got what they demanded, what our society would look like. And the overwhelming majority of people, whether we're talking Britain, Australia, the US, they don't want to defund the police. They don't want to overturn capitalism. They like the nuclear family. So all these ideals that Black Lives Matter is fighting for are abhorrent to them. And yet they'll post the black square or take a knee or go to a BLM march. And there is this group think in so many organisations where if you don't pledge public support for Black Lives Matter, then that marks you as some sort of, undesirable. It really is a bizarre period in human existence right now. It's everything we've seen in 2020, it just seems to be getting weirder and weirder, and I don't know if I can cope with July. I think I need a month just to have a bit of a rest.
One more question about Black Lives Matter, and I want to put their main point to you, because I think we should be fair about representing what most of them say on the media, and that is this: there was this video of George Floyd being killed, screaming "I can't breathe" with this cop on his neck, and that sparked international emotional outcry. And anyone I think can understand that as a human being, that video was really hard to watch. And they say that this is evidence of systemic racism, of police brutality, of black people being targeted by white cops. And many, many, many people, a lot of people, most young people in the West, believe that they live in a systemically racist country because of the examples that Black Lives Matter comes up with of all these black people that have been killed over the years by police. So can you just talk about that specific issue of police brutality, of George Floyd's death, and of systemic racism?
Well, again, it is something that is debunked by the statistics. Now, what happened to George Floyd, in my mind, was murder. It was murder on video. I can't describe it as anything else. Like, how do you kneel on someone's neck for over 8 minutes and not expect them to probably die? So that is, and I think everybody who saw that before the riots and the looting and the craziness started, everybody was disgusted. And then that universal disgust got split when the activists took that as a license to go insane. Now, the guy who did that was arrested and charged with murder within 4 days. 4 days. So what are you rioting for? What are you protesting? And to, again, characterize that as racist because the cop was white and the victim was black. Again, that's such a simplistic way of looking at it. Now, I don't know, the murderer, I know he hasn't had his trial yet, but the killer may be a racist and maybe race was a motivation, but we don't know that. But it's almost taken as gospel that that was what was behind it, even though the other cops who stood around and did nothing to help the poor guy, they were mixed race. There was they weren't all white. So and again, if you look at the actual incidents of black people being killed by cops, it's not always white cops killing black offenders or black people that they're arresting. And you can twist the statistics to say, well, you're more likely to be killed by a police officer if you're black. There's an overrepresentation if you look at the population. But there's actually an underrepresentation if you look at the number of police interactions. Because sadly, blacks in America commit more than 50% of murders. There is greater police interactions with black Americans than there is white per capita. So that statistical overrepresentation isn't reflected fully by the number of blacks who are killed in custody. So there are plenty of stats there, and to suggest that police officers are as a group systematically racist is just, again, an insanity that seems to have been accepted without any evidence. There are bad cops, and I think it should be a lot easier to get rid of them. And I think that comes from tackling some of the hold the unions have on the ability of authorities to weed out the bad cops. But there was an Australian woman in that same very police force where George Floyd was killed. An Australian woman was murdered. She called the cops because she thought there was an attack happening near her house, and she came down her own driveway to meet these police officers, and she was shot dead. Now, she was a white woman. The person who shot her was black. It took 8 months for him to be charged. He has been charged, convicted of murder. He's in prison. He's appealing it. But 8 months before they would even charge him, and there were no riots in her name. There was no suggestion that she was shot because she's white and he's black. There must be some sort of race issue, because there was no race issue. But to characterize every instance where a black person is killed as inherently racist, I think is, again, asinine. And we've got to call it out. We can't just not argue these things, because when there is genuine racism, that needs to be called out too. But if you just characterize everything as racist, whether it is or not, it dilutes the power of that word, and that word should mean something. It's a horrible thing. It should actually carry some meaning.
And it's also interesting in the UK, I mean, we've just had a terrorist attack. I believe all 3 of the victims were gay. By a Libyan asylum seeker. There's no protests in the streets about that. I mean, it's just an interesting point that there's a slight hypocrisy maybe there among the left-wing activists.
There's just so many incidents you see now on social media. Because social media, we can see video clips from all around the world of violent interactions where the offender is one colour and the victim's a different colour. And if the situation was reversed, it would be leading the nightly news. It would be the first item on every website. But if it doesn't fit a particular narrative, it just doesn't get that sort of coverage. And we've just seen in the US, again, the media going berserk over this NASCAR story with the noose. Now, again, anybody with a brain who heard that.
Can you explain what that
away
is? I don't think everyone knows what that is. Can you just...
That's Bubba. What's Bubba's surname? Is it Bubba Wallace?
Yeah.
Wallace? Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So I'm not into my NASCAR, so...
Nor am I.
So the allegation was a noose was left for him in the garage, in the NASCAR garages, and it was a racist attack. It was, he's the only black driver, and this was a heinous racially based assault on this driver. Now, we've heard so many of these before that perhaps unfairly to him, as soon as many of us heard it, we thought, there's going to be another story. One, that area's got cameras everywhere, so if someone's done that, we should be able to establish straight away who it was, who got access to the area. And it ended up being a rope to close the garage door. I'm not explaining this well because I know nothing about cars or garages or the mechanics of how you do all that. But it was just a piece of rope and it had been there for months. And it had been there for months before that garage was allocated to Bubba. And yet the media went insane. NASCAR even went insane. There was all this talk about, how can we be surprised, because all the NASCAR fans are racist anyway, so this just fits. And when it's debunked, when the FBI come out and say this wasn't a hate crime, in fact, it wasn't a crime at all, it was just a rope to close the garage door and it'd been there for months, then that doesn't get the saturation coverage. That doesn't get, gosh, we were wrong. We just maligned a bunch of people unfairly. And there's just so many of these incidents. It's almost like the demand for racism is not being met. So we've got to manufacture incidents to feed the monster that wants to believe that racism is a systematic problem in Western countries, despite the fact that just about, certainly the UK, US, Australia, we've got affirmative action programs where we try to help people of colour succeed, depending on which people of colour they are. They don't apply typically to Indians or Asians, but there are actually programs that are, you might describe as racist in nature because they're race-based, but they are designed to help more minorities succeed, whether we're talking about in STEM or whatever the field is. And yet, again, we have this narrative that there's systematic racism in the UK, the US, Australia, with zero evidence. It seems like if you've got the feeling, or if there's one or two isolated examples you can point to, that's all the evidence you need. And it can be exhausting. I can kind of understand why so many people in the mainstream just don't want to part in this. Because it is just so hysterical and toxic, and they'd rather just ignore it than get involved in the debate.
Well, that's an interesting point. And what do you find it surprising? I mean, I certainly do, that in America they've got Donald Trump as president. In Britain we have Boris Johnson. In Australia you got wonderful ScoMo. Yet there's this cultural revolution, or the left are on the march. So what's going on? Well,
so much I think of what we've seen in the US, which elsewhere have copied, is a reaction to Trump. So much of pretty much everything the left does, particularly in the States, is driven by their absolute loathing of Trump and their obsession with Trump. That if they get a bad coffee in the morning, it will somehow be Trump's fault. It is, again, what happened to George Floyd, Minneapolis, Minnesota, the most Democrat bit of America you can imagine. Democratic governor, Democratic mayor, Democratic council. In fact, I think the councils had 12 Democrats and 1 Green on it. So another Republican to be seen, and yet it is Trump's fault what happened in Democratic heartland. So I think that has a lot to do with it. And the left, as you have seen with Brexit and Trump, are not good at accepting election results. They are openly railing against democracy. And again, I think this is a symptom of that, where they don't like the majority rule, so they're out there enforcing their own rule. And sadly, many Conservative politicians are sitting back and letting them do that. I think it's just an appalling weakness in the political class to tolerate this lawlessness. Protest, by all means, that's a right in the West, but it's peaceful protest. It's not destroying property, it's not looting, it's not bashing people who disagree with you. There's a very big difference between peaceful protests and what we have seen in recent weeks. And in Australia, we haven't seen that sort of violence, thankfully. But our politicians, again, are fairly relaxed. Scott Morrison was asked, he's come out and spoken about statues being vandalised and condemned that. But he was asked about the shows being removed from streaming services, Gone with the Wind having a warning, or Chris Lilly's programs being taken off air. And he's like, well, I don't have time to talk about that. I'm concerned about jobs. Australians have lost jobs in enormous numbers. I don't care about streaming services. And I thought, again, that was so disappointing, because Australians have voted centre-right parties nationally 7 out of the last 9 elections. And yet the politicians have just disengaged from the culture wars, despite the left fighting like hell. If the left weren't fighting them, I'd say disengage, focus on something else. But the left are fighting like hell, and yet the Conservatives, who the electorate keep voting for, aren't reflecting the views of their constituents and standing up when it counts and saying, wait a second, this is actually a load of crap. Australians should be able to determine if they want to watch Chris Lilly comedies. It shouldn't be a decision that's made for them by some woke wanker who's triggered by, Jonah or whatever other character that's not PC. So that's true in Australia too. I have been disappointed by just the weakness of politicians throughout this period in time. But some people say, well, when your opponents are making mistakes, you don't interrupt them. The more they allow this nonsense to go ahead, the more it's going to turn reasonable people against their political opponents. But I don't know. I think that's somewhat of a weak argument.
Well, it looks to me like they're winning at the moment, so maybe that's not the case. I want to end the interview on an optimistic note, and I try and do this. I mean, I've spoken to so many, Conservatives about culture and our current sort of state of society, and they're all rather depressing. So let's end it on a positive note. What are you optimistic about? I mean, we've seen the rise of Jordan Peterson. We've seen the rise of people like you. We've seen the rise of fantastic Conservative figures on the internet. Are you optimistic about that? Are you hopeful about that before you go off on your travels across America?
Before I chuck it all in
Exactly.
and just go on a massive road trip. I'm sorry if I've been a bit negative. I think it's more the mood of the times, because I'm not one who is actually negative. I think the mainstream mainly get it right. They see through far better than the bulk of the media does and other people in positions of influence. So that's something that always gives me great hope. The fact that in most cases that democratic process ends in the right result. And you get the governments you deserve, even if they disappoint you sometimes when they don't live up to expectations. What am I hopeful for? I mean, I think the changing media landscape is though it can be depressing and in many ways, I think that it presents a great opportunity to break out of this cycle where there's a massive disconnect between the mainstream media and the mainstream population, where so many things that the mainstream media believe and advocate for and push and cover endlessly actually aren't important to the mainstream population. And in fact, when it is important, they hold an entirely different set of opinions than those people in the media. So I think perhaps with people being able to have podcasts and programs, there is an avenue to have your views reflected in the media more so than we've had in the past. I'm not sure exactly how that's going to work, because I'm not a entrepreneur or visionary when it comes to the media landscape, but I'm hoping that we don't have a few big tech giants dictating what we have access to. And I'm seeing that now. I'm hoping that is something that is broken, because the enormous influence Google, Twitter, Facebook have, YouTube, is a worry. It's almost as a virtual monopoly, almost, some of these players, and the ideology of much of their workforce and the way they've been able to manipulate and suppress information is a worry. So I'm hoping that there's a way out of that, and I think there will be. So that would be something to be optimistic about.
It does, on that optimistic note. Obviously far more optimistic about your travels than anything else. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, I know. I was trying to think of, being optimistic about...
It's hard.
The changing media landscape actually being more representative of the audience than what we've currently got. But then I actually became negative by talking about how these tech giants have got this virtual monopoly. So you're right. My frame of mind isn't as positive as it should be. I shall work on that tonight.
It's in the beaches of you've got your lovely mojito that you're drinking. That's where you're at, which is fine.
It is. Seriously, I've been working 7 days a week for so long. I'm at the end of my tether. Do not put in. Are you putting this on the actual podcast? My God, I should stop just talking incoherently then.
Don't worry. I found it very entertaining. Anyway, look, Rita, thank you so much for joining us. That's all we've got time for.
Thank you, Stephen.